Welcome to American Dreamtime, the Robert Doc Barham Show. I am Doc, and I am here once again with my co-host, Mr. Ben Cooke. Ben?
Greetings.
Ben, where are you today?
I am talking to you from my world headquarters near Los Angeles International Airport in Los Angeles, California.
Very good. Ben, you know who we have on the phone with us today?
I believe we have a legend.
Are you there, legend?
I'm here. I am absolutely here.
You are. You're already chuckling.
Yeah. Well, you know, when you're legend, just means you're old, and we don't really we have to try and explain to who you are to the audience. So we'll just call him a legend. They don't know who he is. You know.
I'm really excited that you're here today.
We're going to find out.
Yeah, I am really, really excited that you're here today, Rich. Today, Rich Shydner is our guest, stand-up comedian and comic writer. You can find more about him right now, if you like, by going to richshydner.com. That's RITCHSHYDNER.com. You can read about the legend right there. But if you'd prefer, you can also stay tuned here for the next 60 minutes and listen to him yourself. Rich, welcome to American Dreamtime.
Thank you. Thank you.
So, Rich, I would like to talk with you about a project that you've been working on. I want to make sure that we talk about it. It's your show called History of Standup Comedy, the History of Standup, right?
Yeah, it's a history. I call it a history of stand-up comedy because everybody's like, well, mine's the history. Mine's definitive. I'm not the definitive on anything, but I've done a lot of work and research, and this is my take on the history of stand-up comedy. Yeah.
Now, when did you get involved with the history of stand-up comedy? When did you begin as a stand-up comedian?
Well, it really came out of an embarrassing situation. I moved to Los Angeles '82, and used to go to Cantor's Delicatessen late at night. That's where comics would go hang out after the shows. And either Improvisation or the Comedy Store were the two big showcase clubs there at the time. And one night we were sitting there. They had alcohol served till late. I think they had a license. And we were drinking. I got a little buzz when I see at the next table Maury Amsterdam in a booth right next to us. And Maury Amsterdam was one of the stars of this Dick Van Dyke Show, a sitcom in the early 60s. He played a comedy writer named Buddy Sorrell, and I was a fan of that show like most people were my age. And I said, let's go talk to him. Let's go talk to Maury Amsterdam. So we walk over, we introduce ourselves, telling him we're comics at the Improv. And he's kind of like, yeah, I know that place. Yeah, I go there. It's great. What you guys are doing is great. I said, yeah. And I was cocky and a little buzzed. And I was like, well, we don't do like you guys did. We don't tell jokes. We talk about real things in our life. And he goes, well, tell me one of those things you talk about. And I told him one of my jokes. He goes, that was done by Ricky Craig Jr. in 1927. And every time we told him a joke, he told us who did it and when, right? I mean, really. He says, yeah, don't feel bad. I mean, everything's been done. Probably, like, if you tell me a drug joke, it might not be the same. But most of those are just old drunk jokes, too, And so I went the next day. I went the next day to told Bud Freeman at the Improv. He took me over to what we called the adult table. It was a big round table where you couldn't go as a young comic unless you're invited. There's always some celebrities there. That night, I happened to sit there with Harvey Korman, who was one of the stars of gosh, I can't think of it. Carol Burnett show. Harvey Korman. There was Shelley Berman, who was a great comic in his day. And then there was Carl Reiner, who actually wrote and created the Dick Van Dyke Show. I told them my encounter with Buddy. They started laughing at me. They go, you ran into a buzzsaw. Maury wrote most of those jokes. He used to write for Will Rogers.
Is that true?
He used to sell the same joke to Milton Berle 5 times. And then they start telling Maury Amsterdam jokes and stories. They forget I was there. But I felt like I didn't even know who the guy was, really. And then I did some research. He was 18 years old when he started writing for Will Rogers back in the 20s or 30s, whatever it was. Yeah. And he was just one of the first guys to have a TV show back in the late 40s. He was just a guy that'd been around and done everything in showbiz. And I started reading more. The first time I ever read anything in showbiz, not like I was completely ignorant, But when I first got into stand-up comedy back in 1977, my girlfriend at the time bought me this book called The Last Laugh, written by Phil Berger. And that was pretty much a great history of comedy at that time, the 70s, and it covered like the 60s. But I didn't really go. I just started collecting books and reading books, and got into the history of comedy slowly. And then I met Phyllis Diller, and Phyllis was a really smart woman and into the history of stand-up, and we were talking about it, and we both thought the first stand-up comic was Mark Twain, because he did these funny lectures and after-dinner speaking back in the late 19th century. So I started reading a lot of Mark Twain. I read this essay he wrote about the funniest man he ever saw, named Artemus Ward, and he was the first stand-up comic, and that really got me going. That was about, well, I met Phyllis after my third Tonight Show around 86, 87. She called me up, and we became friendly. And around 2005 or something, it was around there, whatever it was, I read this book with Mark Schiff called I Killed. And I think that's when I got Phyllis a story from her for that book. And we talked about Twain, and then I found out Artemus Ward. Then I really started researching heavy. Then I really got into it.
So Artemus Ward is a real person, not a character created by Mark Twain,
Yeah.
but a real man?
No. His name was Charles Farrar Brown. He created this fictional character in the newspapers back in the 1850s, late 1850s. And the telegraph was a new invention, and his newspaper, the Cleveland Plain Dealer, started sending these funny letters to the editor that he wrote under this name, Artemus Ward, of a traveling salesman. They sent them to newspapers all over the country. It went viral. In the terms of today, it went viral. And he had a brand all of a sudden as a funny character, this Artemus Ward. And he decided to go on stage under that name because he could draw a crowd. People would come out to see Artemus Ward live, right, because they were fans of his newspaper writings. And he started doing stand-up. That's the short of it. There's a lot of stuff. I wrote a script about him. I wrote a movie script about him. He's an unbelievable character. It's true stand-up comic in every sense of the word.
So what was, from what you know from your research, what was stand-up comedy like at that time? Since you're saying he's the first stand-up comedian. Yeah.
Well, he did a parody of a show back then. Obviously, there was not radio. He started doing it in 1861 after the Civil War started. He actually went on stage as a stand-up. There was no radio, no TV, obviously no internet, and big part of the of education. Everybody was about education back then. Progressive meant learning, becoming improved. It was all about improving yourself. That was a big thing in America. And they had these lectures. People would go around every town, village, cities, obviously. People would go and they give a lecture. And that was big entertainment. People come out to see the lecture. And you always had to teach them something, either a moral lesson like drinking is bad or slavery is bad, or some sort of education. Here's a lecture on electricity, or a lecture on a new continent that was discovered of Africa, whatever. And he decided to do a lecture of a parody of that, where he would just go up and do jokes with no, like he'd title it, he'd go 60 Minutes in Africa, like, as if he's going to do a lecture on Africa. Well, people knew he did not one thing about Africa till the very end. He'd do all these jokes. At the very end, he goes, oh, yes, I should say something about Africa. It's a long way from here, so if you're going to go, make sure you leave early so you can get back for work tomorrow. And he goes to show. He was a very funny guy. And so it was obviously no electricity, so there was no electronic amplification. It's not like he was just doing these 50-seat rooms. He was doing 1,000-seat. One night in Philly, he did 2,000-seat theater in Philadelphia, where obviously you've ever been in any of these old vaudeville theaters, they were very expert in acoustics and making it so you could speak at the front and hear in the back of the room. People were rapt, they paid attention, and he learned how to project his voice. So he entertained big groups of people, and he was very popular. It wasn't like he was working in obscurity. Lincoln was a fan, Abraham Lincoln. He'd go into the White House. Artemus Ward would sneak into the White House. Show people were very looked down upon. So he had to sneak into the White House and he was a drinker and a lotus eater, which meant he liked weed, marijuana. And him and Lincoln would swap stories. Him and Abraham Lincoln would be up at night swapping stories, and Lincoln would tell him how much he refreshed him, because Lincoln loved to laugh, and he needed to laugh, obviously, during what he went through during the war.
So
he
Lincoln,
became a big star, and he died. He died in England. Artemus Ward died in England.
Sounds kind of like perhaps the first USO performer.
Well, he did perform for, there was a guy named Daniel Rice who was a clown. He performed for troops too. And Artemis did perform for the troops. He did do shows. And he learned, he had to avoid any mentions of the war in his shows. Like in wartime, you want to avoid talking about war, which he did. He learned the hard way. He would do jokes and then people get angry when he was doing jokes. He also got to the point in about 1864 where there was so much slaughter, the losses were so great that the crowds back east, where the war was going on, it was tough to make them laugh, period. And so he went out to the West, and that's where he met Mark Twain, who was, of course, Samuel Clemens, was a writer for the Territorial Enterprise in Virginia City, Nevada, which was that was the Comstock Lode, the big mining town. And they met there. He did a Western tour. Artemus Ward did a Western tour because he just had to get out of the East.
So
I can go on and go on about Artemus Ward. I can go on and on.
Do you have is Rich Shydner your real name?
I had other names when I first started. One of the names was Elvis de Groot. I should have gone on with that name because nobody ever got Rich Shydner right. It is my real name. My birth certificate is Richie, Ritchie, Shydner, Shidner. I changed the I to a Y thinking people would be able to pronounce my name. Instead of doing Shydner, they go Shydner, which is the correct pronunciation. They never got close. Schneider, Schindler. If you see my book, Kicking Through the Ashes, this book I put out in 2016, the cover is just of all the misspellings of my name in newspaper ads and all that sort of thing. No, it was foolish of me.
I think we might need to really emphasize for the listeners here, Rich, you are yourself a part of stand-up history. I mean, you've worked with everybody.
Yeah. Well, I blossomed as a stand-up right when the comedy boom in the 80s started. So I was doing it in Washington, D.C. in 1977. I moved to New York in 79. And the clubs exploded in 1980. And I was out on the road. I had an act. And I could go out and hold an audience for a long time back then. This is before they changed the drunk driving ethos in America, when, the comedy clubs would just keep an audience as long as they could. As long as they were buying drinks, they'd keep a show up there. So they liked you to do a long show. They'd like, go do 2-3 hours. They're selling drinks and sending a fleet of drunk drivers into the night. They didn't care, You'd go into town,
you're the reason we've got all these laws now. I got it.
Yeah, hardly. Yeah. Well, I didn't help. I didn't help when I was driving either. You're right about that.
I mean, everybody was doing it back then.
Yeah. So back in then, people don't remember. Back in the 70s, the police pull you over. They go, "You've been drinking? Yeah. Can you make it home? Yeah. All right, go straight home. Don't go to any more bars. And give me that 6-pack on your front seat. Give me that thing."
Oh my goodness! I remember in high school for me getting Sam Kinnison's tape and how sort of, let's just call it, slightly depraved his lifestyle was.
Slightly depraved. I think there's slightly out of that.
Okay, well, I'm trying to be generous.
Slightly depraved.
And Kim complaining about how we're supposed to get our cars back to our houses and all this. I think there's plenty of expletives in there, but
yeah.
I just want to touch a little bit on this because we've done some shows back. We had another one of Doc's colleagues in the stand-up realm, which is not a world I come from, right? But I'm definitely interested in. And kept circling back on this era that you're talking about, like the 80s, right? And there's been a few sort of specials out that you can go watch now. If it's like Seinfeld did one, I think, for Netflix, right? Jerry did for his journey, right? Kind of came up in that time in the clubs in New York in the 80s. There's one about Steve Martin that you can go watch. And a lot of people were kind of like, he kind of brought this art form to another realm, but you're bringing it back to pre-Civil War. Like,
well, I go all the way. I mean, I go all the way up. I come up through the vaudeville era. I talk about that, everything and how it relates to America. I titled the show "America's Reflection in the Funhouse Mirror" because it's the most immediate art form. You can tell what's going on in America by the jokes being told. You can gauge the zeitgeist, what the fears and obsessions of America are. You'll hear them in jokes. So I go all the way back, but you're right. I mean, it's Steve Martin was. I mean, you were talking about he's the first rock star comic. I worked with him on the movie Roxanne. He's an incredible artist. And what he did, I saw him at the Capitol Center back in '78. I've been doing it about a year, part-time in D.C. And I went to see him. There were like 15,000 people in there, were places where Led Zeppelin would perform or Rolling Stones or whatever big, concert would go in there. He was doing stand-up comedy. There were no screens blowing him up to, 50 feet tall. There was one guy on stage holding 13,000 people.
Amazing.
And it was a cyclone of laughter. It was incredible. And he told me later, one of the reasons why I quit doing it, because at that point, he was no longer performing stand-up comedy. He was just conducting an orchestra because the people kind of knew what he was doing. Sometimes they were shouting out the bits with him. But it was incredible to see him do that.
Well, I remember him when I was a kid, those first two albums. I listened to them again and again and again with my friend. He was one of my favorite stand-up comedians. And there were lots of record albums that I tried to get a hold of because that was the format for the most part back then. Even cassette tapes hadn't come along then. But there were also, and I remember Bill Cosby getting his albums and listening to them, and albums by Woody Allen and folks like that. So tell me, if you would, what did you find out in your research about the vaudeville area, the comedians then?
Well, see, in vaudeville, you had to tour for years and years to build up a name. Right? Newspapers would help, but nationally, to build up a name, this is pre-radio we're talking. Then radio comes along, it's one of the greatest marketing tools ever because you could take 1-2 radio appearances and all of a sudden you've got a national name. And so 20 years of touring could be equal with a couple of appearances on radio. Then TV does the same thing. Now what albums did was there are all these comics that were doing young comics who couldn't get on regular TV or radio because they were too far out of center. Radio and TV wanted to sell product. So young comics like Lenny Bruce and Mort Saul, Jonathan Winters, all these comics, they were too far out there for radio and TV in the late 50s. But the long-playing LP, the record album, right, 33 and a third album came out. You could put 15, 16 minutes of material on a side. And most importantly, the portable recording equipment could go into the comedy clubs or the theaters where these comics were performing and perform them live with the laughter, with the whole vibe that you would get from watching them live. And then college students, other people started getting these albums. They did an end run around corporate television and radio, and that was a great marketing tool. These young comics became popular, and then TV had to put them on because they always want to put on what's popular. So that's what the albums were great marketing tools back then. And of course, then you could put things on the albums like George Carlin's 7 Dirty Words, which you couldn't put on anything. They couldn't play it on regular radio. They couldn't play those dirty words. So then you could get things on a Cheech and Chong album about drugs or those things that Carlin was talking about. that you couldn't get on regular radio or anything. Again, it's a marketing tool. That's what obviously podcasts are today. Comics today don't even care about going on late night TV, which was big in my day, to market yourself, to get your name out there. They do podcasts. They don't care about network TV. It's irrelevant to them. Their generation likes to discover them on podcasts. So those are marketing tools. That's what they are.
So are there vaudeville comedians, to go back to that for just a minute, are there vaudeville comedians that you really liked?
Oh, my God, yeah. There were great vaudeville comedians. You talk about Fred Allen, who then became big on radio. When he was a young vaudeville comic, he wrote a lot of things that comics still do today, one version of it. Like say a tray of drinks is dropped, and a comic will go, put that anywhere. Yeah. Well, Fred Allen first said that back in vaudeville. Or some woman would yell something in the back. He goes, well, thanks, Mom, right?
Yeah.
Responded to a woman heckler by saying, thanks, Mom. But that's Fred Allen. He wrote a lot of jokes. Or he did a joke. He said, California is a good place to live if you're an orange. Right? That was a joke from him back in the 1920s or 10s or whatever. Well, I remember hearing a comic say, I grew up in the Bronx, which is a good place to live if you're a bullet. Right? It's the same joke. Right? So he was a great writer. Fred Allen was a great writer. And there were a lot of great vaudeville comics who don't have careers. I mean, Milton Berle started in vaudeville. It was a training ground. It was a training ground for every comic generation. Has to have a place to train where you can be bad before you can become good. And then, of course, the bars opened up back when they had Prohibition come in 1920, January 1920. You might not remember this. I don't remember this, but it actually happened. It's an incredible social experiment. They tried to outlaw alcohol in America January 1st, 1920. It's like it didn't go so well, but at all these illegal bars, comics moved into there, and they never left.
Well, now, vaudeville, there were vaudeville stages around the country, right?
Oh, yeah. Every town had one. And every block in New York, every neighborhood had a vaudeville theater. Vaudeville theaters were everything. And, of course, there were these different levels of them. You know, you want to work the big time, right? That's the big time theaters, New York or Cleveland or Chicago, whatever, or the sticks, which would be like small towns in Scranton or whatever. That became a dichotomy back in the 1920s. You're going to work one or the other. You really couldn't work both. There's a story of a guy who was working with them. He was in vaudeville work, and he's working with a big time headliner, you know, and I can't remember who it was, but the he's out there, and the young comic's working with him, and he's killing. Young comic's killing, and he goes, hey, Mr. Rogers, you know, or they say the guy's Will Rogers. He said, you know, I'm killing every night. You hear this, and it's Scranton. They love me here in Scranton. And he goes, how come I can't play New York? And the older guy goes, because they love you in Scranton. Your act's built for Scranton, not New York. You know, there was that dichotomy. It still happens today. It's a cultural difference that we still see today. That was the beginning of the culture wars of the 1920s.
So the vaudeville stages, which were around the United States, would you say that they are like the precursor to the stand-up comedy clubs around the United States that really popped? When did they really pop up? Because They started in 1880, around 1880. Before that, there were these concert saloons. That's where there was no good place for stand-up comics to perform. There was no microphone, no electronic amplification. They were really brothels. They were men in these bars, and all the women working in there were actually working like, you know, they were prostitutes. And so in the balconies, where they take the men up to the balconies to service them, and the guys were watching these shows down in this concert saloon. There was no room for any kind of subtlety, or these guys are drunk and horny and crazy, and they would have. That's where you had like slapstick. You'd have two guys beating each other with sticks on stage for comedy. But then in 1880, a couple of theater owners noticed that you know, Americans were getting an industrial revolution was kicking in high gear, and you had a middle class forming where people had a little bit more leisure time, a little bit extra spending money. So they said, let's bring the family into the theater. So they outlawed single women. They outlawed alcohol.
and they said no cursing of any sort. And when I mean no cursing, you couldn't say gosh or darn or holy gee. These were considered verboten. Forget any of the words you might think of, 4-letter words or 8, 10-letter words. There, no cursing whatsoever, no reference to a deity. And they forced you to clean up the act, and it became very popular, right? Very popular. And comics moved in. That's where Jack Benny started. There were a lot of big-time comics who started in vaudeville and built up their acts. And then, of course, radio or television later made them famous.
No, I was wondering where all the clubs with the single women, alcohol, and cursing went.
Well, burlesque form vaudeville was clean, right? Then, of course, they had to have some sort of dirty, risque theaters come along, and they were burlesque theaters. And then in burlesque theaters, you'd have guys, baggy pants comics on stage doing risque, dirty jokes, and women, dressed in lingerie or almost like strippers on stage with them. So you had jokes that were obviously, a little bit dirty, a little bit more risque than, nothing like what today. You'd think today, even by today's standards, it would be tame. Yeah.
Well, Rich, were there any of the vaudeville comedians who went into film that you liked a lot? When I was young, I remember watching black and white films of Laurel and Hardy and the Little Rascals and
Teams worked well on the films. They did. Yeah, I haven't seen many old, early talkie pictures, from the 30s of stand-up comics performing. They didn't do that. They did teams on film. They filmed a lot of teams, Burns and Allen, and like you said, Laurel and Hardy, of course, became very popular. But I don't remember. There's not many comics that they taped on film back then doing stand-up. Will Rogers was a huge comic back then. Huge. He was the biggest star. It was one of the first really big stars. He's the first one that did a tour outside of the vaudeville theater. See, in vaudeville, when they said you were a headliner, that means you closed the show. That was, how many minutes you did on stage? 17 minutes.
17 minutes to close, like a TED Talk.
That's it, 17 minutes. That's it. Most acts were like 5-6 minutes. Vaudeville acts were quick and fast. They did 8-9 performers. Bam, 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 finish your show. The last act was not the headliner. The last act was what they called the closer or the chaser. The chaser was so bad that the audience would run out of the theater. They wanted to get the audience out so they can get a new audience in. So they had a chaser act, right? A singer that was so bad it would make you, like nails on a chalkboard, that kind of thing. So, but 17 minutes. But Will Rogers did his own tour when he was truly a headliner. And he would do 2-hour shows by himself eventually. When he first started, of course, he had to build it up. But he eventually did his own tours outside of vaudeville, for Walden, so to speak. And then he did political material and otherwise. I mean, he did, political material like we have the best Congress money can buy. And then jokes like they were a little bit even risque by their standards. He said, we all learn different ways. Some of us learn by observation. Some of us learn by reading, and some of us learn by peeing on an electric fence.
I think I'm still working on that one.
He did. Here's a joke of his that you'll hear comics still do this today. But the car, of course, was new, and back in the 20s, the popularity of the car was really coming on. So he did a joke. He said, I want to die in my sleep like my grandfather and not kicking and screaming like those other people in this car. And I still hear comics do that today.
Hi, I'm Ben Cooke, founder of Ben Cooke Communications. And we are listening to American Dreamtime, the Robert Doc Barham Show. I'm also the co-host. Thanks for listening, and be sure to tell your friends to listen too.
So did you...
It sounds like it's tough to come up with the original material.
Well, yeah, everybody, look, you can come up with things. Everybody builds on it, but like, Artemis Ward, right? So when there's a new bit of technology, obviously something new is going to come out of the comics. And you heard my joke I just did, Will Rogers joke, actually, of the guys in the car. So what was new in the Civil War was the camera really came on, right? Photographs really came on, and the camera came on. So Artemis Ward had a joke that I heard as a kid. When I was a kid, I heard this joke. People were doing it. So the guy was so ugly, he broke 5 cameras. It's a joke from 1862.
That's perfect.
Right? Yeah.
Is there material like from Artemis Ward still out there? Like,
well, he was pretty smart. You know, he was an old newspaper guy, so he didn't want the newspapers printing his jokes before he came to town, obviously. So he did a show in London. That show, his manager wrote it all down, and after he died, published it. So his show in London we have, and then I had a woman in Canada, a researcher, a few years ago, find me hundreds of articles, old newspaper articles, when Artemis Ward was very popular. So I was able to glean jokes out of that, and in the books, there was 5 books written about him, and so I was able to find a lot of jokes about him that he did. One of his jokes was, and there's a lot of it. You could sound familiar, but it's actually his joke. He says, this was a big joke back then. He said, when a person says it's not the money, but the principle of the thing, it's the principle of the thing. I mean, excuse me, I'd mess that joke up. I said, when someone says it's not, I messed the joke up. When someone says it's not the money, but the principle of the thing, it's the money. That's the joke.
There you go.
Anyway. But there's a lot of jokes of his that you go, well, that kind of sounds familiar. But it's actually, anyway, he was a very, very bright guy. Very, very. I'll tell you this one. This is, I think, is so brilliant. So when he went out west, he actually went to Salt Lake City because he'd done jokes about the Mormons. The Mormons were a new phenomenon, a new religious phenomenon, a new religion, right? And the whole thing about polygamy had gotten a lot of attention. So he went out there because he would do jokes about him. He said, I want to see them for myself. And he went out there, and they treated him very well. They nursed him. He was very sick when he got there, and they nursed him and saved his life. And he had a lot of affection for them. But when he was leaving town, his manager says, well, what do you think of this new religion? And Artemis Ward says, the same as all the other religions. It's all about pennies and petticoats. And I'll translate that for today. Money and women. That's what it's about. He said, it's another religion where men create God in their image for women to worship. Is that not a brilliant line?
That's Artemis Ward?
That's Artemis
Pennies
Ward.
and petticoats?
Edgy.
Pennies and petticoats.
Edgy for 19th century humor.
Yeah. Very edgy.
Rich, when you started writing, when you started performing stand-up comedy, were you using any material from anybody else?
No, but it was, look, you find your influences slipping in, you go, I'm kind of doing a thing that kind of, like I remember once when somebody would be incoherent in the audience, like a heckler incoherent, I'd do this thing where I'd twitch, and blink my eyes and twitch, my head would twitch, and people would laugh because I'm acting like, you're just confusing it. I go, that was a Robert Klein move. And when I realized I got to stop doing that.
Oh.
Now, I did one night, I opened up for, this is so bizarre, but Rick Danko from the band went out on his first solo tour. I opened for him in Washington, D.C., which is a long story, but the short of it was I had to come back up on stage after I'd done my set. Now, I only had about 15, 20 minutes of material back then, and I'd done it all. And they were like, he left the stage. He was messed up, and he left the stage. And they said, you got to go back up and hold the audience while we get him back up there. No, I had no more material. And by this time, I was drunk and high on cocaine because I'd been partying with him after I did my set. And I was so messed up. I got up on stage, and I'm trying to do any bit I can remember, like a George Carlin, but I'm doing a George Carlin setup with a Richard Pryor punchline. I'm mixing and matching. I'm like, it's a real mess. And I mean, but everybody at some point, and I'll just not say everybody, but I know I've done this, where where you're spritzing on it with the audience, you know, and you're doing crowd work, and all of a sudden a line pops out and you go, oh, that's a line by, you know, somebody else. I know that's not mine, and I don't like to do that. You know, that one of Robin Williams' gifts was he had no filter like that. He just, whatever came out of his head, whatever came into his head came out of his mouth. And that's part of what was so good about him. But it would piss comics off because he would do other people's material, you know, right? Because if he heard you do it and it got a laugh, he was likely to do it himself. But as a performer myself, and I really check stuff around. Like I tell you this, I'm driving out to the Comedy Magic Club one night, which is a great club in south of Los Angeles. And a joke comes in my mind, wholly formed. I go, you know, the Olympics were on at the time. I go, you know, the people who come in last in the Olympics, they come in last. All that training, they come in last. I could come in last, and I don't even train. And I thought, this is a great joke. But I said it came to me too clearly, and I get out to the Comedy Magic Club, and I ask around before I'd go on stage and try it. And I asked Jimmy Brogan, he says, oh, yeah, that's Franklin Ajayi's joke. I said, I knew it. I knew it was too good to come out of it. So I'd always check if it was too good, you know.
It seems almost impossible to maintain like a Jeopardy champion level of knowledge of who told what joke.
Yeah. It's difficult. You know,
so I think it seems like there needs to be a little bit of leeway there, right? Like,
there's thing called which we talk about parallel thought. You know, two comics come up with the idea independently without knowing. There's that. The only time I know somebody steals from you is if they saw your act and they didn't say anything afterwards. Like, you know, you're working with some comic and they open for you and then they don't have that joke in their act and they see you do it and then you see them again, they do that joke. Where'd you get that joke? I mean, they got it from you. They didn't have it. They didn't say to you, like, if I work with a comic and I have a joke that's similar to something they're doing, I'll tell them. I go, look, I'm not doing my joke because you're already doing this joke. But I do have a joke like that, and this is what it is. I want you to know that. So if you ever see me do that joke again, you know I didn't just hammer off your joke. And that to me is what you have to do. But they once tried to get together a comics union, you know, a union of comics, which just doesn't work because, you know, we're not all working together for the creative single project, like a car factory. You know, comedy's a pirate ship. It's all yo-yo-ho and a bottle of rum until the job shows up. Then it's every man for himself. So there's only one microphone, but they tried to do this union. And one of the things that Tom Dreesen was a great comic, was talking about putting this union together. We will have a comedy court to decide ownership of bits. Which I thought was hilarious because comics would be like, I did that joke in my first 5 minutes. The other comics like, I did it in high school before I even started doing comedy. I did it in my bar mitzvah. I mean, you know, who's going to determine who did it first or what? I mean, it's very difficult.
Well, I remember when I was watching stand-up comedy, like particularly like you were talking about earlier with Evening at the Improv. I was probably, what was the first year for Evening at the Improv on television?
I did the first one on early 82, but they taped them in 81, and I taped one in October 81, my first one in October 81.
So you were one of those stand-up comedians that I watched and I've talked about this before, but we had a big television set in the basement of my house, and I went down there, and when cable TV came on and we got the Evening at the Improv, you were one of those comedians who I saw who was inspiring to me. And I remember I started keeping a notebook. I had my own pen, and I had my own spiral-bound notebook, and I'd start writing down names of comedians because I wanted to remember them. And then I tried to keep track of them when they went on other television programs like late night, Carson, things like that. And I also remember writing down jokes of certain comedians and using that as a guideline to figure out how to write stand-up comedy. Because I hadn't gone quite then. I hadn't quite gone to going to the library or going to the bookstore or another place like that and getting books on how to write comedy and stand-up comedy. And I found that trying to model those people who I watched on television without trying, I remember watching Dennis Miller live in Washington, D.C., and I walked out of there with my girlfriend, and she said to me, I was looking down as we were walking out, and she said, "Are you okay?" And I said, "Yeah, I didn't know you could do that." I'd never seen a comedian who did those kinds of references like that and never worked quite like that. And it had a really profound effect on me. And so I went home and I decided I'm going to learn how to write a joke like that. The purpose wasn't to rip off Dennis Miller. It was to actually learn how to write a joke like that. And so I found that through watching shows like Evening at the Improv and things like that, it was really, that was kind of part of my comedy school. You were a big influence in some regards.
Well, I appreciate that. We all had those influences. I mean, your generation got a chance to see a lot more stand-up comedy than we did. It was very difficult to, you could watch The Tonight Show with Johnny Carson and stand-up comedy. Some daytime talk shows would have them. It was hard to see them. It was hard. I had to go out live. I saw a lot of comics live at one point in the 70s. But yours came, that's why you guys came preloaded with so many joke forms, because you have started watching all this comedies on cable TV with the Evening Improv, all the other shows that came along. There were a dozen other strip shows of doing stand-up comedy in one version or another. And then there were all the specials that started coming on HBO and then Showtime. And so there was a lot more content available. Now today, a young aspiring stand-up can watch 1 billion hours of YouTube videos and podcasts and everything. I mean, there's just so much stand-up. And so you come, like you did, you're trying to figure out how to do this particular joke form, like a reference comedy that Dennis Miller did. So there's just so much more ability to learn before you're actually going to do stand-up yourself. Of course, there's no replacing or no getting around the experience of performing live in front of a live audience, which is what stand-up comedy is. But you can come pretty knowledgeable, which is what you did probably.
Now, when you went to Los Angeles, you said that was 1982?
Yeah.
Did you have any formal training in like acting or like in the theater arts? Or did you have any on-camera formal training? No. So you were learning as you went on stage. I took acting classes. I took some in New York, and then of course I took them in Los Angeles. The only thing I ever learned about acting, the only thing I know about acting is I'm not good at it. That's what I know. For sure. Well, you've done a fair amount of acting, though, right? If you go to your website,
I have.
Some of the programs that you're on.
I'm okay with it, but I didn't come from a theater background, more of an athletic background. Approach stand-up comedy in that way, probably more than any kind of theatrical. I just didn't have that knack. I watch some great actors, and I'm always amazed by them. They disappear in the role. You can't even see anything but that person doing what they're doing at the time. It's incredible. I was always self-conscious on stage. I'm listening to the other actor going, okay, getting closer to my line, getting closer to my line. Here comes my line. Here comes my line. Why is my hand moving? Where's my hand going? I mean, I just didn't have that ability to really be in the moment in acting the way I was in stand-up comedy. When I'm on stage performing stand-up comedy, I'm totally in the moment in a way I'm not that way in any other part of my life. It's magical. I'm only there in that moment, getting those laughs. And what's next? What am I going to do next to get a laugh? And it's incredible. That's part of the drug of doing stand-up comedy, that and the laughter.
And now you are performing History of Stand-Up Comedy as a show, as a presentation now, right?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, it's a funny show. I know it's not easy to tell from what I'm doing here, but it's a funny show.
Well, now, are you taking it to comedy clubs, to theaters? What are the venues that you are performing in and wanting to perform?
Well, I've done it in little theaters. I've done it in theaters, and I've done it in comedy clubs. I'm going to do it at a comedy club up in Philadelphia area in June, and I do it at other places. I just haven't found like a regular thing. I don't think it's not an easy show to market, and I've not found anybody behind me that really can do that. So it's not been easy to get but when people see it, they love it, and especially I don't know what to say. Older people tend to like it more than younger people, I guess.
It would seem like there's a great opportunity for a series or.
You
see these types of things on like CNN, right? Where it's like the history of comedy.
This could be. I mean, I do it live, right? Obviously, but I've sketched out about 4 hours worth of. It could be a docu-series.
Interesting. I do stuff, right? And Doc and I go back years, and he's helped me with my businesses over the years, and we decided to do this show because we just like talking to interesting people doing interesting things. So, but it does feel like there is whether it's going back to in the 1800s, right, and talking about sort of the birth of stand-up there, or through the 20th century, et cetera. There's a lot to be learned from it, because it's as you said, right, it's a reflection, right? It is. It's not just dates and names and facts. This is how people felt about what was going on in the world.
That's right. You can today. Will Rogers started where people would listen to his radio show, and it was a comedy radio show, but it was about politics and what was going on in the news, right? And they would get the news by listening to his show with humor, which is what the Daily Show is today. Most young people don't read the newspapers to get the news. They get it from funny shows like the Daily Show
or TikTok.
Yeah, TikTok videos, right?
YouTube. It's sort of all out there. I would think there is a serious play there, Rich, with some of your colleagues and contemporaries. You can't help but marvel going to your website and seeing these amazing testimonials from sort of our modern day Mount Rushmore of comedy. It seems like you could get, going back to the conversation of union, maybe not a union, but certainly a gang of these folks together to do a walkthrough of all this, because it's fascinating.
My idea to do it, if I did it as a streaming docuseries, is to do it a live show and to have different comics come in at different times to interview on stage or talk to them about either their era or whatever, certain points. So I would like to absolutely have other people involved.
Then you'd like to film it in front of an audience.
Yeah, absolutely.
Almost like a performance.
That's right. Oh, no, I have to. Look, stand-up comedy is about being in front of a live audience, and I want that laughter. And I have other ideas about how to handle things and do things, and what's different about stand-up comedy, pretty much any other performance art, is heckling from the audience is sort of acceptance, crowd participation. The crowd's integral. There's no laughter, there's no show, so the crowd is part of the performance. And so I have a way of using the heckler device in this show. So yeah, I'd like to make it as close to an actual stand-up show itself while discussing the history, but there's a steady laughs. I mean, I have so many doing old jokes that work and funny stories, and there's a lot of that.
Amazing. It absolutely can be done, right? And you can point back. We're sort of recording this at a time, and I don't want to date it, but a few weeks ago here in 2025, Saturday Night Live aired their 50th anniversary special live.
Absolutely,
and it was magic. That audience, that participation, that bringing back people who had made the show so special over half a century,
right?
And it was just such a treat to watch. I mean, they you could easily sort of do something like that where it's maybe over a course of nights, because it's a very rich history, right? How do you
a huge. There's so many eras, and there's so much that's relevant today in some of these eras. But sometimes it's when people talk about cancel culture, there's only one comic who's ever truly canceled, and that was Lenny Bruce. Now they tried to cancel comics before him. W.C. Fields, they tried to cancel him. There's always been that, but cancel culture today most days is used by comics as a marketing device again. When they go, oh, I could get canceled for that joke. They want you to believe they're dangerous. You want to go out and see a comic who's on the edge, dangerous. So they'll all kind of market themselves as that way. Oh boy, I'm gonna get canceled for this. They're trying to cancel me. Oh, got to see this guy. Got to see this person. There's only one person that they actually tried to. They had a First Amendment trial, and they tried to cancel. Was Lenny.
Oh wow. I mean, you could
6 month trial for obscenity. He had a 6-month trial in New York City for obscenity. 6 months. Not insurrection, not murder, not arson.
Words.
Obscenity. Obscenity. Words. Saying words in a nightclub that adults had paid money to come here and say.
Amazing.
I remember getting a copy.
The government tried to shut him down. Yeah.
I remember getting a copy of him performing during that time where he took the court transcripts on stage and did stand-up comedy with reading from the court transcripts.
There's a performance. That's performance film. That was Lenny's mistake when he lost his sense of humor over it. He started fighting it on their terms. You can't fight on their terms, And he lost his sense of humor about it and just tried to become a lawyer himself. In fact, that whole story is incredible. He actually tried to then become a lawyer, and his lawyers were like, Lenny, let us handle it, and you just be funny. But he lost his mind over it. He could not understand why they were doing it. They weren't doing it about obscenity, really. That was just the reason they came up with it. And I'm not saying it was a conscious effort. They were really, the real problem with Lenny was he was doing jokes about religion, the hypocrisy of religion. He was a Jewish guy doing jokes about not just the Jewish religion, but the Christian religion. Uh-huh. And that's where he got in trouble.
If you listen to his albums now, they sound almost tame. Not exactly tame, but they don't sound, when you listen to it, at least when I listen to it, I never thought anything like, well, this guy needs to go to jail, clearly. But they're still funny. They're still funny albums.
Yeah, but he wasn't dropping the F-bomb, randomly. He used those words in specific areas. But you're right. I mean, by today's standards, but you can only judge a comic by the comics they were performing with in their era. You can only judge them about the competition they were performing with. And Lenny was so far ahead in every area back then. He did jokes about divorce. Now, you think a joke about divorce is nothing today. But in the late 50s, people didn't talk about divorce on stage. It was an embarrassment. It was shameful to get divorced, right? It was a societal no-no. And Lenny did jokes about it before anybody else was doing jokes about just that. There's
that mirror again, though, right? How do we challenge our notions of what's taboo? And how do we...
I'll give you another example on Lenny. So everybody had mother-in-law jokes back then, right? I mean, that's almost a cliche. The mother-in-law jokes back in the 40s and 50s came out of the fact that you had multi-generational families living in one roof. So you had the mother-in-law living in the same house. So you had problems, right? So the mother-in-law jokes. But here's Lenny's mother-in-law joke. Yeah, my mother-in-law broke up our marriage. My wife came home from work early and found us in bed together.
Well, hey, I want to let you guys know.
You never heard a mother-in-law joke like that, did you?
I want to let you guys know that we've got just a little bit of time before we have to wrap up, and there's a couple things that I want to address. I want to ask you one quick question, Rich, which is, how do you think that you and your work and stand-up comedy helps to make the world a better?
Well, it's comic relief. It's taking the stress out.
Yeah.
And putting things in perspective so that everything doesn't seem so bad. And the more stressful the situation, the more comedy is needed. Mark Twain said, the secret source of humor is sorrow. There is no laughter in heaven. There's no comedy in heaven. So I have 2 books on my shelf about death camp humor. These are jokes that were done in the Nazi death camps in World War II. Two books on the kind of humor that came out of there. There are no books on cruise ship humor. You understand what I'm saying? That's when you need it. You don't need it. That's why I hate doing resorts or vacation places to do stand-up. I never liked doing it because you're not needed there. People aren't stressed out. They're on vacation. They're in the sun all day. You know what I mean? It's like, go to New York City. That's the best place to do stand-up comedy. There's a lot of stress in New York City. You need it there. That's where you need it. Stressful times need more comedy.
Well, Rich.
Perfect.
Thank you very much for being our guest today on American Dreamtime. And I hope that you will be coming back to see us again in the future. Is that all right?
Sure. I'd love to. Thanks, guys.
Okay. That is Rich Shydner talking about stand-up comedy and the history of stand-up, his show. Ben, thank you for being here today, too.
You can also contact me. Yeah, anywhere. Okay. Thank you. Thank you, guys.
Ben, thank you for being here today as well.
Thank you, gentlemen.
Okay.
Thank you, Ben.
And that's all for today, everybody. That's another episode of American Dreamtime, the Robert Doc Barham Show. I'm Doc. You heard Ben. You heard Rich. And that's all for now. We'll see you again next week.